My father loved maps, like really loved them. Not the big, pretty historical kind, but the practical ones you would get from AAA or Rand McNally. He kept all his maps in an old shoebox, and if anyone mentioned a trip they were even remotely thinking about planning, he would get out his old shoebox and dig around until he found what they needed. It wasn't worth it to refuse him. He would just keep offering until you took it. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't a gentle old soul sort of concern. He thought you were going to need a map, and it was a serious error in judgment if you left the house without one. He was trying to save you from yourself. He would probably end the conversation by calling you a dingbat or a meathead, a reference to one of his favorite TV characters, Archie Bunker. I grew up in northern New Jersey in the 70s and 80s. There are a lot of people in New Jersey, and a lot of little towns strung together by a complicated network of roads. These roads are filled not only with cars, but a multitude of public transit options. Our town was filled with lots of little farms that gave New Jersey its nickname, but were quickly disappearing. The houses in my subdivision were built on an old apple orchard, and the 2 dairy farms nearby were also turned into subdivisions while we lived there. A lot of those families were supported by working in New York City. When we first moved to New Jersey, my father drove to a parking lot where he would park for the day, then took the train into New York City to his office in the newly opened first tower of the World Trade Center. How to get into Manhattan was a big decision that said something about you. Each mode of transportation came with pros and cons. The train was more civilized than the bus, more comfortable with bigger seats and a refreshment car. But the buses ran more often, had more stops, and were cheaper. Some people didn't like public transit options at all and drove in. This was generally the most expensive option. Knowing how to navigate public transportation was an essential skill for a bridge and tunnel kid. Any trip to New York City started with having a general picture of the island in mind so you can plan how to approach it. Once I knew if I needed to be uptown, midtown, downtown, east side, or west side, then I could figure out which modes of transportation would best accommodate my trip. In the pre-smartphone world, this meant a typical trip would require 3 important documents: a train or subway map, a timetable, and a map of the city streets. With these tools in hand, I could start plotting a course by decoding the symbols. Each route has a color and either a number or letter depending on the subsystem. Routes may either be in dotted lines or solid lines depending on hours of operation, and different types of stop, like local, express, or transfer, get a different kind of shape on the map. Once you plan out the route, then you check to make sure the schedule works how you want it to. The tricky part is finding the right schedule. I could be traveling during normal hours, rush hours, there's a weekend schedule, and a holiday schedule. Once I figured out the right sequence of trains I would need to take, public transportation would only get me so far. After leaving the station, there is always the disorienting moment of being above ground and trying to figure out which way to go. If you're in the part of Manhattan that is a neat grid, you get out of the subway and look for the number on the street signs to point you east, west, north, or south. For instance, to go to the Met, I'd get out at 86th Street, head toward the trees of Central Park, and away from the water of the East River. Once I made it to Central Park, I knew it was a quick left to head south to 82nd Street. There are so many great connections between modern-day wayfinding and historical exploration or pilgrimage. We look for signposts and identifying landmarks. We orient ourselves in space by thinking about other objects. Our street signs are the new constellations. And if I think about things that way, then all those mischievous, up-to-no-good nights of my teenage years, navigating subway systems in New York, get transformed into a sort of sophisticated seafaring Viking expedition. I'll leave you with how the author Wade Davis sums up the practice of wayfinding. The science and art of wayfinding is holistic. The navigator must process an endless flow of data, intuitions and insights derived from observation and the dynamic rhythms and interactions of wind, waves, clouds, stars, sun, moon, the flight of birds, a bed of kelp, the glow of phosphorescence on a shallow reef, in short, the constantly changing world of weather and sea.